Gaza War, day 305. No end in sight. Let's begin right at the fronts. We have in Gaza very active fronts. We have, you may have heard a field report or seen a video of a ambush in Rafah near George Street, I believe. George Street, Rafah ambush. I'm sure you'll see the video tomorrow on Electronic Intifada live stream. Lots of rocket attacks on the Netzarim corridor and elsewhere. And also, pertinent to Gaza news, you may have heard that after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, that the new leader, the new head of the Politburo of Hamas, has been elected by the Shura Council of Hamas unanimously to be Yahya Sinwar. Yahya Sinwar is known now as the mastermind behind the October 7th operation. He's in the tunnels. There are Israeli hostages that were released in November that said that he came to them personally and told them no harm will come to you. My name is Yahya Sinwar. You may know a bit more about him. You may know that he was a prisoner for life in Israeli prison, but was traded in a prisoner exchange for an Israeli prisoner of war and got out that way, that he learned Hebrew in Israeli prison, that he wrote a novel in Israeli prison, The Thorn and the Carnation, that his specialty in Hamas was counterintelligence, the finding and dealing with collaborators inside the organization, spies inside the occupied areas. You may know that he is basically a resistance leader, not a diplomat, not a political animal, I guess, more of a resistance leader with a resistance mentality. And so this is why by assassinating Ismail Haniyeh, the Israelis have got themselves instead of the mastermind of the October 7th attack as the head of Hamas. So I don't know if this disincentivizes the Israelis from their assassination policy. I don't think it does. I don't think they understand the world in any normal way. So I think they think of themselves as immune to behaviorism and so on, because they have the will, the triumph of the will. So they want to assassinate Yahya Sinwar now, and they want to assassinate Hassan Nasrallah now, and they just want to find a way to kill their way out of this situation. In the West Bank, there's fighting in Jenin as we record. No, I believe it's fighting in Nablus as we record. I think the raid on Jenin is over as we record tonight. There's also airstrikes. I believe I mentioned airstrikes in Tulkarm in the previous sit rep, but there were airstrikes in Tubas and Jenin as well. A lot of resistance fighters that died in these recent attacks, but also major resistance attacks with IEDs, improvised explosive devices, in the West Bank. So major fighting in the West Bank persists since last sit rep. Lebanon, the northern front, northern Israel, Lebanon. Lebanon has been hitting deeper and deeper into the Israeli depth. There was a major drone attack with a whole bunch of drones getting through and hitting in Acre or Akka, occupied Akka, which is deeper than the extent of the normal attacks by Hezbollah. And there was also inside Israel an Iron Dome incident where the Iron Dome missile fell on a road, and there's a video of the explosion, and it's quite a big explosion, which is why people are using that video and explaining that this could be the reason behind, this could be the type of explosion that happened in Majd al-Shams. I still believe that it was done on Majd al-Shams was done by the Israelis, targeting that community to try to create a division between that community and the Lebanese resistance groups, unsuccessfully. So all of the fronts are very active over the past 5 days, and Gaza is definitely extremely active. Also, Israel. What else can I wanted to tell you something else about Israel. Oh, no, no, it wasn't about Israel. You may have heard, in case you missed it, that the it wasn't to do with Israel exactly. The Russian, I think the head of the Security Council, or a very prominent minister in the maybe the Minister of Defense, but someone very prominent in the Russian military, like the government, and specifically the government ministry that deals with the war in Ukraine. Shoigu is his name, and Shoigu went to Tehran, and a whole bunch of people from Shoigu's entourage went to Iran, and they met with their counterparts. So this is a very high-level meeting on military affairs and military cooperation. There have been military planes from Russia landing and dropping off cargo, various systems. People think it was electronic warfare systems that they were dropping off and that Iran is setting up. And it was a scheduled meeting apparently, but I'm sure that the Israeli attack on Iran and the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran was a major topic of conversation, and Russia came out to support Iran's rights of self-defense and so on, and also presumably their right to hit Israel back to try to disincentivize this type of assassination. I heard, I haven't confirmed, but I saw news that the North Korean, the DPRK president, I think, I don't know what his, let me look up his title. And make sure I get his name right too while I'm at it. He's, okay, succeeded by Kim Jong-un, the General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, and the president. Yeah, so the president of North Korea, the president of the DPRK. So he's the president of North Korea, and he basically, I saw news that he offered some form of nuclear cooperation with Iran should Israel try to go nuclear with Iran, or America go nuclear with Iran. So I will try to look further into that, but Russia and North Korea have defense cooperation. Now Iran and Russia have defense cooperation, so maybe they're forming some larger bloc, or at least loose forms of military cooperation through Russia. They all have unique military assets and specialties. You probably know that North Korea is supplying Russia with shells. You probably know that Iran is supplying Russia with drones for use in Russia's war on Ukraine. So there is presumably something there both of these countries are getting in return, and that may come into play in this war that is expanding in the Middle East, a region, whatever you want to call it. West Asia, I suppose, is better than the Middle East. So I think you're probably here to hear about Nasrallah's speech. Nasrallah made a speech today to commemorate the martyr Fuad Shukr. He talked more. Last time he talked was just shortly after Fuad Shukr's assassination by Israel in Dahiya in Beirut. And this time he talked a little bit more about him and about his history, as well as talking about the region and the war and where things are going. And it was a very interesting speech in a lot of ways. You probably remember that I predicted several speeches ago that the war was going to start in July. And I thought I got the sense that it was either intelligence that Hezbollah had, or just that Israel was so unmoored from ordinary military logic that they were going to attack as soon as they could. And they didn't. And here we are in August, and they've made these provocative assassinations, and they seem to be expecting a response from Hezbollah especially, but also Iran. And it hasn't happened yet. And Nasrallah later on I'll get to the part in the speech where Nasrallah says it's like the Israelis want us to hit them. They want to get it over with somehow, and they can't live with this tension. But that's part of what Hezbollah and Iran and Yemen have been doing, is letting them wait and letting the tension build a little bit instead of rushing into a counterattack. I also think, as I mentioned in the sit rep with John on day 300, that the Israeli defense, the joint Israeli Western collaborator defense that they've prepared to try to intercept the standoff weapons that Iran and etc. are likely to attack with, is a pretty impressive, it's a pretty impressive set of assets that they've assembled. So doing a big one-off or trying to repeat April, a lot of those holes that Iran exploited are probably closed in April. I know we talked about how Iran obtained a lot of useful intelligence by doing the attack in April, but we have to also count on the fact that the US and Israel gained a lot of intelligence about what Iran can throw at them and are preparing according to the assumption that Iran is going to try to throw more at them this time. So the other thing that I think that I'm considering when I consider how this war is going to continue to expand and roll out is the thought that the long-term evolution of this conflict over the past, if you think on a decade scale from 1948 on, or maybe if you want to think from the 80s when Hezbollah and Hamas were both formed, the people that are the principal protagonists of the war, their backer, the Iranian Revolution, was in 1979. So let's say from the 80s, we have this new phase. Egypt was defeated and turned into a collaborator. Jordan was defeated decades before, in the 1967 war. Syria, Syria was definitely a player in the 80s, but it's been quite devastated since the Civil War imposed on the US regime change campaign since 2011. So, but if you think of, the players in the axis of resistance, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, Syria, they were all fighting Israel since the 80s. Iraq was in there too, but Iraq was destroyed from the 90s on. So if you think of these protagonists that are facing Israel and the US today, they were all fighting since the 80s. And the evolution of the resistance since the 80s in terms of technology, in terms of their missiles and their standoff weapons, in terms of going from stones and improvised explosive devices and suicide bombers on soft targets like urban centers and shopping malls and buses, to anti-tank weapons and rockets that target military bases directly and drones. You see that the technological gap, the intelligence gap, all of these things are getting progressively more and more narrow, and the resistance is bringing more and more, is closing the gap in terms of firepower. They're still massively outgunned, but you don't necessarily have to reach, as a resistance movement, you don't have to reach 1-to-1 in order to win liberation. Historically, guerrilla wars have won, guerrillas have beat occupiers and colonizers in Africa and Asia in the post 1950s, 60s, the many guerrilla wars across Africa and Asia, the guerrillas won against the imperialists with much less than 1-to-1 correspondence and firepower. It may have been 10-to-1 in Gaza, with Israel, and at the beginning of this conflict in the 80s, or if you go back to the 60s, it was, I don't know, 100-to-1 or 200, 1,000-to-1. But now it's not that. And it's approaching the level. It's approaching the level where liberation is a viable thought from a military perspective. And that is why Israel is going all out and committing genocide and trying to go to war with all of its neighbors and calling in all of its favors and calling in the Americans in the West and all the Arab dictatorships to defend it from these resistance axis, because the long-term trend is in favor of the resistance. The short-term chaos and genocide gives them an urgency and makes Israel want to do as much as they can in as short a time as they can. On this short time scale, the resistance is battling the genocide. The urgency comes from the genocide, and the long-term consideration is if they can just survive, if the resistance can just survive, in a few decades, the technology gap will be completely closed, and they'll be able to just, almost like the Afghans did in 2021, the Taliban, they'll be able to take back their country by sending a series of WhatsApp messages, which is how the Taliban took the country back from the American sponsored army in Afghanistan. So unfortunately, though, they don't have decades because Israel's forcing the issue by committing genocide. So they've got to go to war with the army they have. They have to go to war with the firepower they have. And that's why Israel is trying to have this war now when it favors them. On the other hand, maybe it doesn't favor them. And so that's the calculation, is can we get out of this genocide without having to watch everything, maybe the whole world, go through total destruction? And I don't know the answer to that. That was an interlude just to discuss the long-term trend and what Nasrallah's responding to strategically. None of that came from Nasrallah. Let me tell you more about what Nasrallah said. He started off, people may have heard that he started off by saying the Israelis might might do like sonic booms over the crowd to try to disrupt the speech. And he said if they do, just respond with the appropriate chants. And then the people started chanting. And he kind of said, just like the chant you folks just did, which means like he's also got a feed back to them. It's not just a kind of a one-way video feed. So he is somewhat interactive with the crowd when he gives one of these speeches. He talked about Fouad Shukr and a bio. John said he was hoping for a bio in the last speech, and he did get a bio in the speech, a little bit more. He talked about how brilliant Fouad Shukr was, how knowledgeable he was in all areas, general knowledge and religion, what kind of a teacher he was, what kind of leader he was. And Nasrallah said, he said this before, and I've talked about this in Sit Reps before. He said there's always a dilemma when Israel kills one of our leaders, which is we want to talk about how great the leader was, but we don't want Israel to enjoy so much how much of a victory they are, how much of an achievement it was to kill this leader of ours. And so he says, it was a big loss. It is an achievement, just like the Israeli assassination of Ismail Haniyeh was an achievement, and he's not denying it. but it won't stop us. It won't shake us at all. And the men that Fawad Shokr or Syed Mohsen is how he referred to him in the speech. Nasrallah referred to him in the speech. The men that Syed Mohsen prepared and mentored and taught and trained, they are the ones who have been leading the operations against Israel since Israel's since the assassination. So he talks, then he goes into his analysis of the political situation, and he, like I also agreed and thought of this, that the Knesset vote to say there will never be a Palestinian state ever, that was a big deal. And Nasrallah says that was a big deal, and it should be a big deal, especially to anyone who's still foolish enough to believe in the path of negotiation. There is no path of negotiation. And he says something really interesting. He says, the Palestinian Authority, Arafat, when they went into that Oslo Accords, trying to get Palestinian freedom and a Palestinian state through negotiation, Nasrallah says they gave up their rights, but he says God replaces leaders who give up the path, and they were replaced, and that's what happens, and that's the way that it always goes. So he's kind of saying, it's not that Oslo lost Palestinians their rights. It just means that Oslo lost the Palestinian leadership of that time, their status as leaders. He talks about how the Palestinian finance minister said, unfortunately, the world won't let us kill everyone in Gaza, which he said, it seems like they will. The world is letting them, but he's kind of using this to show the futility of negotiation, the importance of all-out resistance, because these are people who are openly just talking about how they want to kill everybody. And then he gets into what Netanyahu's agenda is, what Israel's agenda is, how they want to, their goals in Gaza, as he understands them. Their goals in Gaza are to exterminate as everybody, if they can, as many people as they can, to break the will of the resistance. And then he talks about what the consequences of that would be. It's a theme that he's made in his speeches before. He says that, you may remember the speech that we broke down here about how the price of resistance is lower than the price of capitulation, the price of surrender. And even though the price of resistance is high, the price of surrender is worse. And he then talks about what would happen if Israel wins. If Israel does manage to break the resistance in Gaza, then Israel blows up the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israel destroys Jordan as well and turns Jordan into their subordinate occupied Palestinian non-state that would then be under Israeli control. It spells bad news for Egypt. He says our whole region will be destroyed if the Israelis win this war, if they meet their objective. So he says that the Israeli project is, and they've said this very explicitly, that they want Israel from the river to the sea. And he says the resistance wants Palestine from the river to the sea, and every other project of partitioning or whatever, all intermediate projects, he says, will dissolve. They're not realistic and they have no future. So, but then he also says something, he said something fairly subtly, I thought. He said, our objective in this war is to prevent them from destroying Gaza, from defeating the resistance. He said, we're not in this war, unless I misunderstood, but he said more or less, in this war, we are not trying to destroy the entity. In this war, it is sufficient to prevent them from meeting their objective of destroying the resistance. So he's again, this is kind of what I was saying when I said that they look on a longer term horizon. It would be in their interests to not make any sudden moves and not go for a big regional conflagration where things become unpredictable and maybe Israel and America's firepower advantage can make the difference. Instead, the more patient they are, the longer they can wait, the more the technological gap closes, and the easier it'll be to win liberation when everything is prepared. But the genocide makes things urgent. The genocide has to stop now, which is why he, in previous speeches, always said, we're willing to stop everything as soon as the Gaza war stops, as soon as there's a ceasefire in Gaza. That's a victory from our perspective. And he didn't say that this time. I think that's a big difference. And I think that there's a reason. I think that the resistance is coming to the conclusion that there isn't going to be a ceasefire, and they're trying to prepare and measure their response for based on their new understanding of what Israel is doing and where Israel is going and how the US is backing them and how nobody is going to back off in the face of whatever response the Axis does to these assassinations. I think they're increasingly realizing that Israel is not gonna be deterred by it, and so they have to respond in a way that prepares their position for the war that will follow and the rolling out of the war as it goes. So he assesses Israel. He says, I'm not saying Israel is weak, but Israel is not as strong as it was. In contrast to 1967 and 1973, Israel's called all the Western countries to come and defend it. Their radars and satellites are on high alert, and yet the drones reached Acre. The Hezbollah drones reached Acre despite them being on the maximum level of alert. So he says the Israeli threat can't be faced by trying to bury your head in the sand. You can't flee from the storm. You can preserve your head by burying it in the sand, but they'll cut your feet off. They'll cut you into pieces. So kind of extends that metaphor that you can't bury your head in the sand. So he says you have to confront and prevent, when we all have to prevent Israel from achieving victory here. So then he talks about like the horizon of the battle, and he says, even though, so he says the short-term goal is to prevent the Israeli entity from defeating the resistance. But the horizon is Palestine from the river to the sea. But then ultimately what he says is, he's not, what he promises at the end is not a big explosion that's gonna wipe Israel from the map. What he promises in the end is that this war is going to continue. So he makes these calls. He says, we call on Gaza and the West Bank to keep fighting and to continue persevering. We call on the support fronts in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen to continue supporting Gaza. He says, to the people who don't support us, don't fear our victory. You need to fear the Israeli victory, not our victory. If you don't support us, at least don't betray us. Don't stab us in the back. Don't participate in the psychological war against us. So he talks about how Fouad Shoker, the commander that Israel assassinated, he said, he had a way of doing sonic booms over Israel too. He said, they can do sonic booms to us, but we can do sonic booms to them. And Nasrallah apparently told him, "Don't bother. The sirens are scary enough to these cowards inside Israel." So he kind of said, "This is not something we need right now." Then he goes into all of the economic losses that Israel has suffered. He expresses some anger at all of the Western delegations going to Iran and Lebanon, trying to tell them to calm down. He's like, now you're telling us to calm down? You didn't even condemn the killings of civilians and children in Lebanon and Palestine, but you want us to calm down? You want more time to get a ceasefire when you didn't get a ceasefire in 10 months while this genocide continues? So he says we're not he basically promises that the response is coming, but I think he's kind of conditioning listeners to the idea that this is ultimately a war of attrition, and that this is not going to be a war of like one big conflagration or a war of destruction. And I think he's understanding how how little Israel is able to walk anything back, how all of the retreats of the past from 2016 and 2014 and these times in 2021 when Israel's kind of withdrawn in the face of the costs of war. Now Israel is committed to going forward in spite of all the costs, and that is a change that has forced the resistance to recalibrate a lot, I think. And that's where where Nasrallah concludes. He talks about how this is a big battle. This is a big battle, and we we have to prepare, and we're not going to do it. We have to do it responsibly, and we can't act we can't demand anyone to act on any particular schedule. He says the enemy's decision to go to a full-scale war is complex, but when they want to go to war, they don't need a pretext. This is a really, really important line, I think, because he's basically, again, trying to prepare the public, I think, in Lebanon as well, to understand Israel, to not say that the resistance brought this on themselves. That's the heinous thing that people say about Hamas, right? That they brought all of this on Gaza, as if Israel doesn't have this responsibility for what they're doing, as if the West, it's just the most normal thing to just commit genocide in the face of people trying to break out of the prison you put them in. So it's the same thing he's saying. He's saying the decision that they're making, it's a complicated one because they have to consider all of the destruction they're going to face. But when it happens, it's not going to be the resistance's fault. The Israelis are going to either make something up like they did with Majd al-Shams, or they'll just attack out of nowhere. They'll commit a whole bunch of assassinations or drop a whole bunch of bombs and wait for the response. The thing is, if it does turn to a ground war, it could also go on for years. I mean, I don't know how closely people watch the Russia-Ukraine, and I've said many times on this channel, I've been watching it a lot closer than you might think from what I've report from the basically zero reporting that I've done on it. But it's a very disproportionate conflict in the sense that, Ukraine has the backing of the whole West, but Russia has vastly greater resources than Ukraine. So there was every reason to think that the outcome, I don't think, was ever in doubt, but it's gone on for years, and it could go on for a long time yet, even though the outcome is almost certain. And so it could very well be that that this full-scale war, whatever shape it takes, however much the Americans get involved, and wherever the ground confrontations take place, whether it's Hezbollah actually fighting in Galilee or the Israelis trying to invade, or both, maybe at the same time, fighting in the Gaza envelope could happen. Again, all of this could happen, and it could go on a long time. And when it goes on long, again, it favors the resistance, I think, except for the absence of relief of the genocide. So these are the two timelines that we're facing, that I've been talking about from the beginning of the whole sit reps, 8 or 9 months ago, that these two timelines are in conflict with one another. And the long run, which is an inevitable resistance victory, and the genocide, which the clock is ticking on the genocide, and it's already been an intolerable, absolutely intolerable, an intolerable situation. So I will stop there. That was Nasrallah's speech. It was, it was a summary of where we've gone, and another a promise of an ongoing war, not an imminent conflagration by any means. And as you know, to repeat, Yahya Sinwar is now the leader of the Politburo. I think he was already a major leader in Hamas, but now he is officially that. That also means that the official spokesperson, the diplomat, the person who flies around, that's going to be someone else. That's not going to be the head of the Politburo. That was the role. Ismail Haniyeh had both roles. He was a public face, an open, lives out in the open kind of person. There are other such people in Hamas, and maybe one of them will pick up that task of having the open meetings and talking to the press and things of that nature. So yeah, those are the changes as of tonight. The war goes on. The fronts remain open. The response is yet to come from the axis for these assassinations, and maybe Israel will try to attack again and call it a preemptive strike on top of their previous unprovoked strike, on top of their colonial aggression and genocide. Well, and I will be back for it all. So like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next. Tomorrow is the live stream. You've probably already queued that up, and okay, we'll talk then.